Good evening, everyone. I want to get right into our study this evening. I have just a lot to cover tonight. I apologize in advance that I probably won't take a whole lot of comments or questions. That's mainly because of the wealth of material that I have to cover, and because I disagree with our Waldron book on the way that he takes this book. And so I wanted to really be very careful to explain my view about the book of Ecclesiastes in a way that is clear and helpful, and that just has been very stressful for me trying to figure out how to do that. So let's go to God in prayer on that note, and then we'll start. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you for the entire Bible, even Ecclesiastes, Lord, that sometimes causes us to scratch our heads and don't always fully understand what's going on, God, but we pray that you'll guide us in our study of your book, and that you'll help us to handle your word accurately, and that you will teach us the lessons that we need to learn. Be with us this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. So Ecclesiastes has been a thorn in the sides of believers for centuries. It is often wondered, how could this book be in the Bible? I mean, it's just so negative and depressing and pessimistic. Ecclesiastes is uncomfortable. It kind of makes us squirm, and many have decided that now that we're Christians, well, this book has no value to us. People have also decided, well, now that we're Christians, I'm going to find a way to maybe interpret the book that's going to make it a little bit more comfortable to deal with and won't make me squirm as much, which again I disagree with, and we'll talk about that later. But I hope to show you that this book has tremendous value. And tremendous value even more when we really understand what it's teaching. So what we'll do is we'll introduce the book, but simultaneously teach all 5 of the first chapters. Adam apologized for the way he arranged that syllabus, and we'll probably not do that much material in the future, but hey, we're going to do our best. So let's talk about the author just very briefly. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Now, as you read in your Waldron book, there has been some debate over who wrote this. Is it Solomon? Is it somebody else? And we just don't really have time to hash that out in class. I am going to assume that the author was Solomon. That view makes the most sense to me. He calls himself king in Jerusalem. He's the son of David. He has all this wisdom from God, all these riches. I mean, it really makes the most sense that it's Solomon, but of course that view is not without some problems, as you no doubt read in your book. But he also calls himself the preacher in the New American Standard Version. The original word for preacher there is koheleth, which means a wise man who gathers an assembly together to teach them wisdom. Here's a question. Does anyone know the Greek word? Now, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. Anyone know the Greek word for assembly? It's also church, right? It's also the same word translated church. So church or assembly. Ecclesia. All right, ecclesia. Now, in the Greek word for a person who gathers an ecclesia. And so the book is called Ecclesiastes because that's the English transliteration of the word ecclesiastu, or a wise man who gathers an assembly to teach wisdom. That's where the name of the book comes from. Now let's talk about the basic message of the book, verses 2 and 3. And this is why the book is so maybe viewed as depressing. He says, "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun?" So basically it says all is vanity under the sun. And by under the sun, he means this earthly life. It's not meant to be some sophisticated term. It's just the reality when you walk outside and you look up, the sun is up there. And we're down here beneath the sun, underneath the sun. And so he's talking about life on this earth. Now, the key to understanding this book, and what's very difficult to do, we must set aside our knowledge of heaven when reading this book. He does not mention heaven at all here. The entire book is limited to describing this earthly life. And one of the reasons this book makes Christians so uncomfortable is because we keep reading our understanding of life beyond the sun into the book, when he's not talking about life beyond the sun at all. He's talking about life under the sun on the earth. The word vanity in Hebrew is hevel, which literally means vapor or breath. But also, as you kind of read through the book, you notice that word is also used in other ways like empty, futile, pointless, temporary, worthless, superficial. All is empty. Wow. Let's go get them. All right, come forward while we stand and sing, right? The message of Ecclesiastes is quite simply, earthly life is vain and empty, so fear God and keep his commandments. That's the message of the book. Now, we want to explore in the book why he says that earthly life is vain. And here's what's interesting. If Job were to write this book, we would say, well, no wonder he's saying life is vain. This is a king writing this book. Somebody who has it all. He's not in misery. He's not suffering. He has all the riches he can want, all the wisdom he can want, all the women he wants, all the building, money for funding building projects. He has everything, and then he still says all of it is empty and futile. And so it leads us to wonder, why would he say such a thing? How is this life vain? Well, there are many reasons, and I'll get you guys to give me some in a second, but I want to give you the number one reason. This is the foundation for understanding why life is vain. Death. We all die. Remember, when God first created man, he puts him in this garden paradise. Everything is wonderful. They're going to live eternally. They have the tree of life there in their midst. And yet God puts a condition on them, and he says, you better not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely what? Die. Now, certainly there's a spiritual application there in the sense that they would die spiritually, kind of be separated from God. But it's also the case that physical death entered the world when sin entered the world. And so God, as a part of the curse of sin in Genesis 3:19, he tells Adam and Eve, he says, from the dust you were taken, and from the dust you shall return. It was at the moment that death entered the world that life on this earth became vain. All vanity. Now let's go to the New Testament. Let's look at Romans 8. Romans 8. Find an interesting teaching here in Romans 8. Because Paul's talking about suffering for the sake of Christ, and he looks forward to the day when he'll be resurrected in glory in the end. But he makes the point that before we are resurrected in glory to go be with God, we have to suffer in this life, not only for the sake of Christ, but also we have to suffer just being in this painful, sin-cursed world. And he says we're not alone. He says all of creation feels the vanity that is on this earth. And I just want you to listen or watch his language. Look in Romans 8, verse 20. He says, for the creation was subjected to futility or vanity. Not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself also will be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but also we ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. Did you notice? God purposely subjected all of creation on this earth to futility and vanity as a curse of sin. He did that on purpose. Why? He answers it in the text so that it would basically create in us a longing to be set free from it, to turn to God, so that He would one day release us from this vain world. And even Paul the Apostle says he eagerly awaits that day. Now, let's go back to Ecclesiastes and talk about this death problem in the book of Ecclesiastes. He describes it in a lot of ways. In Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 4, he says, "A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever." Well, what he means by that, of course, is that one generation dies and another one rises up in its place. And even worse is in verse 11. Verse 11 says, "There is no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There will be no remembrance, there will be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still." Here's an exercise. Raise your hand if you know the name of your grandfather. Pretty good. Raise your hand if you know the name of your great-grandfather. I'm impressed by that. Raise your hand if you know the name of your great-great-grandfather. All right. See, so I could keep going. Great, 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 great. And the hands were gradually decreasing over time. I mean, they could have lived the greatest life in the world, but you don't even know who they are anymore. And if God lets time stand, there's going to be a group of people maybe talking about Ecclesiastes, and people are going to raise their hand and say, "I don't know any of you either." We're not going to be remembered. It's all vanity. We just die, and the generation that comes after us forgets about us. How about chapter 2, verse 15? Chapter 2, verse 15, "Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity." He says both the wise and the fool die. So what's the point of being wise? Now, again, we get defensive, right? And we'll say, yeah, but we need to be wise to go to heaven. But he's not really talking about that here. He's simply looking at life from an earthly perspective and noting that death makes our choices in this life ultimately pointless, because no matter what choice we make in this life, we're still going to just be in the grave under the sun. We're all going to the ground. So for instance, chapter 3, verse 20 is another one. All go to the same place. All came from the dust and all return to the dust. Death is the great equalizer under the sun, right? The wise and the fool, the rich and the poor, the righteous and the wicked, man and animals. We're all on the same plane here when it comes to the vanity of life caused by death. Now, what are some other things? And I'll have to talk about them in the order that I'm going to have them on the screen, but I do want your participation here. What are some other things, according to Ecclesiastes, that make this life vain? Death is the foundation, but there's some other things too. Terry and then Bill.
Well,
hang on one second, Bill.
The things that you have accumulated in this life, that you worked hard for, get left to someone else.
Okay.
You didn't have to work for them.
Good, right? So sometimes you work so hard in your life, you just leave it to someone else. So you kind of lose what you have, and nothing really lasts forever. Bill?
Well, basically, the thing is, life under the sun does not last forever.
Yeah.
It is the problem for all mankind that under the sun,
Yeah.
he will lose everything that he has.
That's right.
And finally, it will be his life.
Yeah.
And under the sun, all of that exists. And obviously, the point is, if you look to God, and under His, you again have everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good answers, Debbie.
Knowledge. You have so many people that string of, PhD and masters and all this, and they just know all this stuff, and they go to school for forever, and they can be really smart.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really matter. They're just gonna die. Like
What's that going to get you when you die?
Yeah.
All the PhDs after your name didn't help you escape the vanity. John, and then Matt.
Going back to what you said earlier with vanity, and if you look at it as emptiness, a lot of people are chasing things to fill a void in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if I can just acquire this, I'll be happy.
Sure.
And it's more of, we kind of joke about this in certain things, it's the chase of the acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
It's not actually getting it, it's
Yeah.
the acquisition of it.
Sure.
Because once you got it, you're like, I got it. It's like, yeah, it's kind of cool, but I need another one.
Yes.
I need another. I
Yes.
need another. And you just, next thing you know, you get 2 or 3 storage facilities.
Yeah.
And you're just writing checks.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's a great point. That another reason things are so vain in this life is because nothing in this life really satisfies us. Nothing this earth has to offer gives us lasting, true satisfaction. Matt?
I'm going to take it, John's right. I'm going to take it further. It gets more uncomfortable for us, I think, because a lot of us sitting here, we go, we're all that stuff. But it can even be your spouse,
Yes.
your children,
Yes.
your good deeds.
Mm-hmm.
None of those external things are going to really satisfy.
Yes.
God will.
Amen.
And I struggle, it's hard.
Yeah.
Those are good things,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not.
Exactly. Even the good things of life cannot satisfy because life is vain, and that's exactly right. And we're gonna get into more of that later. So moving on to more detail here, because you all said really good things. Nothing on earth lasts forever. We can't take our riches with us. Look in Ecclesiastes 5, verses 15 and 16. It kind of says what Job says. It says, verse 15. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what advantage to him? What is the advantage to him who toils for the wind? You're trying to grasp wind. You can't really ever, it just escapes you. Every time you try to grab it, it goes somewhere else. That's what it's like, trying to grab hold of this earthly life for satisfaction. Chapter 4, verse 16, talks about a king who, he's popular. He's this new political leader, and it seems like everybody is supporting him. But then in verse 16, says, there is no end to all the people, to all who are before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind. So even popularity doesn't last, right? You get up to the top, and then you fall very, very quickly. Look in chapter 3, verse 18 and 19. This is the point that Terry was making earlier. He says, I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I labored, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. He's like, look, I followed the Dave Ramsey plan my entire life, and I saved all this money, and I was super responsible, and I never went into debt. And then I died, and I have no control over my money anymore, and some fool got it. And even if it's my own child, maybe my child becomes a fool, and he doesn't follow Dave Ramsey, and he just squanders all of it. And now, what good was all of that in the end after my death? Also, there's no. Hang on, Bill. I'm not going to take many comments, Bill. I gotta keep rolling. I know you got a lot, but I know, Bill. Just hang on to it, okay? Hang on to it. There's not always justice for the afflicted, okay? In this life, look in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 16, 3:16. Furthermore, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. Or how about chapter 4 in verse 1? Chapter 4, verse 1, Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. I mean, it still happens today, right? But it has always been the case on the earth that some people are unfairly and unjustly treated and oppressed by people in power. And there's no one to help them because they don't have money and they don't have power. And so people don't have an interest in helping them. And so they just stay oppressed. And that's just one of the things about earthly life, unfortunately. Also, here's one that's it's kind of humorous, but it's also sad. Earthly life is on loop, and we cannot escape it. It's like Groundhog Day, right? Just every generation does the same thing over and over again. Look in chapter 1, verse 5. He says, "The sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again." Verse 10, "Is there anything of which one might say, 'See this, it is new'? Already it has existed for ages which were before us." You know, for thousands of years. The sun has just been rising in the east, setting in the west, and then rising in the east, setting in the west. And all the while, rising in the east, setting in the west, in a circle, people are dying, more people are being born. Then those people are dying, and more people are being born. And then those people are dying, and more people are being born. And with every generation that comes, they think, hey, we have the solution to the vanity of life. We have found the key to happiness. And so every generation has their own unique thing, right? We've got, the iPhone, right? We have a lot of really neat gadgets, and we think, boy, the iPhone, way, way more sophisticated than those iron chariots that they used to have back in the day. Everything we have is so much better and more technological. Guess what? We still all die. The iPhone has not solved the vanity of this life. And then another generation is going to come someday and say, the iPhone, that was like the iron chariot. How primitive is that? We've got, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's not even in my imagination. But they're gonna forget what we discovered in our generation, that this didn't solve the vanity problem. They don't remember that we didn't solve the vanity problem. They're going to think we can, though. And we're going to have all these new things, and it's not going to solve it either. We're all on this loop. It's like the conveyor belt at the grocery store. You ever just think about, you put your groceries on the belt, and it goes up until the groceries check out. And then the next person comes, puts groceries on the belt, and they just check out. That's how life is. Right? You come here on the conveyor belt of earth, and then you check out and you die. This is Ecclesiastes, okay? This is what he's describing as it is a little depressing, right? And this is why Christians squirm over this book. They're like, oh, how is this in the Bible? This can't be godly. I don't understand what's happening. We'll get there, okay? Others, they think, well, I can escape the vanity of life by living it up with sinful pleasure. And as John indicated earlier, especially sinful pleasure, but even good pleasure, but especially sinful pleasure, it doesn't satisfy. You just want more and more. But even good pleasure, even if it's not sinful, even if it's, hey, I'm going to take on these building projects, I'm going to really leave my mark in the world, I'm going to serve in my community, I'm going to really do all these great things, it's still vanity in the end. This is exactly what Solomon did in chapter 2. He does this grand experiment. He says, look, I'm going to do everything. I'm going to do absolutely everything there is to do. I'm going to own absolutely everything there is to own. I'm going to build everything there is to build. I'm going to be wiser than any person on the earth. And then look what he says in chapter 2, verse 9. I became great, increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor. And this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done and the labor which I had exerted. And behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Still no escaping the earthly loop of futility and dissatisfaction. Also, life is vain because we have very little control over how life goes for us. It's so unpredictable. It's so uncontrollable. It just seems like things happen and we have no idea why. And we're confused when things happen. So chapter 3, I think, is devoted to this concept. He says in verses 1 through 3, just to give you an idea, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up. And then he just kind of keeps going through that. But his point is, look, there's just things happen in life. There's good times and there's bad times. And a lot of times you can't do anything about it. The times, it seems, are appointed. It just happens, and we didn't appoint the times. God did, though. He acknowledges that God is the one who set this earth up this way, so that there would be all this kind of tumultuous, and I say set this earth up this way only after we sinned. Okay, as a curse of sin, he set the earth up this way. Okay, the times are largely out of our control, but God is in control. We're not. Also, we know there must be more than just this earth, right? We know this earth is vain. This can't be all there is, but it's all we can see. Physically, with our eyes, we can't see anything else. We can obviously have God's revelation and believe that. I get that, but he's not talking about that. He's just talking about on the earth. Under the sun. We know there must be more, but we can't see it. And it kind of drives us crazy a little bit, right? He says in Ecclesiastes 3, notice this, verse 11, God has made everything appropriate in its time, and he has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God had done from the beginning, even to the end. It's just so obvious that mankind has always had a sense of eternity in their heart. Even without a direct revelation from God, the very fact that they're made in God's image, we as human beings know there has to be eternity, right? This conveyor belt, right, of death and life and death and life, this cannot be all there is. It's just not. It's not right. The animals aren't really thinking about this stuff, right? The horse isn't bothered by this stuff, but human beings are, because we have eternity set in our hearts. It really, really bothers us. And God did that on purpose, right? So that we would seek him, so that we would know we're meant for something more than just this earth. So I want to be clear about what the vanity of life does not mean. Okay, two things that it does not mean to say that this life is vain. First of all, it does not mean that what we do doesn't matter. He's not espousing the view that, well, life is vain, so just do whatever you want. Just live however you want, because it doesn't matter, because we just all die. He doesn't say that. No, he advocates for wisdom. And in fact, all throughout the book, he's telling us, fear God and keep his commandments. He's saying it really does matter what you do. Look how he says it in chapter 2, verse 13. We looked earlier at 2:15, where he said, what's the point of being wise? But he does say in verse 13, I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. He's saying, certainly, it's way better to be wise than to be foolish. And then in chapter 5, verse 4, he talks about service to God. He actually says, when you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. So again, you see him saying that, no, what you do matters. You need to actually live for God. In fact, the central argument of the book is that because earthly life is so vain, the most important thing we can do is serve God. But he's also not saying, and this will sound strange at first, but just think with me about this. He's not saying that you can't have any satisfaction in life at all without God. He's not saying that. Sometimes we get the picture that Ecclesiastes is saying, if you don't have God, then you're just an absolutely miserable person. And you can't have any happiness and no pleasure and no enjoyment whatsoever on this earth without God. It's not what Ecclesiastes is teaching. But I understand why people might say that. Look, for instance, look in Ecclesiastes 2. Forgot I didn't have that on screen. Ecclesiastes 2, 24 and 25. Because there are verses like this throughout Ecclesiastes, where he says in 24 and 25, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen that is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? So again, some take this to mean that without God, you just can't have any enjoyment whatsoever on this earth. There is absolutely nothing fulfilling in any way on this earth without God. But vanity does not mean that things in this life can't make us feel good or give us some sense of feeling fulfilled. I mean, you look at people who, maybe a person who doesn't believe in God, but they're very family oriented. And so they spend a lot of time with their family, and they get some sense of fulfillment from their spouse, and they enjoy their family, and maybe they have a very rewarding career, and so they do feel a sense of fulfillment there with that. There are a lot of really attractive and good and wonderful things about this earthly life that God has given both the righteous and the wicked to enjoy. And we can find enjoyment in all kinds of things. But there's the catch. Whatever satisfaction we get, even if it's good satisfaction from our families, like Matt was saying, or from our spouse, whatever satisfaction we get from this earthly life is still vain because it's only temporary and we die. So the key is to get our satisfaction not from this earthly life, but from God. That is where our satisfaction comes from. That's where the deepest form of enjoyment on this earth comes from, when we're not relying on the earthly life to satisfy us. See, when we fear God and keep His commandments, it sets us free from trying to get more out of this earthly life than it can provide, which ironically sets us free to enjoy the good things for what they really are, just temporary gifts from God. It's when you try to put a headlock on this earth and say, you will give me satisfaction, you will meet all my needs, you will fill my void, like John said, that you can't have true enjoyment. It's not saying you cannot have any enjoyment, but you can't really enjoy life to the fullest if you're holding on so tightly to it for your source of ultimate fulfillment, satisfaction. So here's the million-dollar question. And this is at the heart of why I take a differing view than Waldron does and of the traditional view. When you believe in God, and let's just say even when you become a Christian, does earthly life suddenly stop being vain? I mean, don't we all still die? Isn't life still a vapor? Here, the next, here and gone, or here now and gone the next. James chapter 4 talks about that. Isn't life as a Christian still unpredictable and uncontrollable by us? And sometimes very confusing and unfair? And isn't there a lot of senseless suffering on this planet? Will generations to come remember our names simply because we're Christians? Don't Christians sometimes feel the injustice even against themselves? Can Christians take any of these earthly possessions with them? No. Because this earthly life is still vain, even as believers. Now, the traditional view, and the one Waldron takes on Ecclesiastes, and the one I used to hold, but I changed a few years ago when I taught a whole quarter on this book. I got to study it in a little bit more detail. That view is that earthly life under the sun is only vain without God. But when you have God, now all the vanity of this earth is gone. I just do not think that is fair to Ecclesiastes or to Scripture. It sounds really good, and it makes us more comfortable with the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's a much more comfortable view to hold, because it doesn't make us squirm as much and deal with the reality of life as much. But I really don't think that is an accurate view. And one of the main reasons that people hold the view is because of those verses that we read, for instance, there, where it says you can't have enjoyment without Him. But this verse does not say earthly life isn't vain with God. It says we can enjoy life. The word enjoyment here does not mean fulfillment or deep, lasting, meaningful satisfaction. That's not what enjoyment means. The word just means excitement, just, eagerness and excitement. He's not saying with God, all these earthly things will now fulfill you. He's saying with God, these earthly things still don't fulfill you, which is why you need God, because He does. He is the source of our fulfillment. Satisfaction is from Him. And when that is the case, we can still enjoy the good blessings of this life, and we can enjoy them to the fullest, because we know they're not the source of our ultimate satisfaction, and we know they're temporary, and that's okay. And then when bad things happen in this life, we're not as disappointed, because we know, hey, this is earthly life, and it's just vain down here because we're living on a sin-cursed planet. So, to say that earthly life is no longer vain with God, what we're saying is when we have God, earthly things satisfy us. And that's not true. In fact, they better not. God satisfies us, and then we can be set free to see life for what it really is and to not hold too tightly to it. And that is the key in and of itself of having more enjoyment of this planet, because we just see it for what it is and not for how the world sees it, which is all there is. I want to make sure I get through my points here. The writer, I was going to go to chapter 3. I meant to click that. Enjoyment doesn't mean genuine soul satisfaction. Earthly life still doesn't satisfy believers, even though we have God. Only God satisfies believers. So here's the key. The writer, call him Solomon here, is not trying to depress us about earthly life. He's trying to detach us from earthly life. He's saying that earthly life is vain, but our spiritual life is not, because that will prepare us for the place of eternity that God has set within all of our hearts. It's a very unorthodox, roundabout way of saying what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 when He said, "Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and whether thieves do not break in and steal." And in that context, Jesus is actually talking about the vanity of this earthly life, trying to store up your treasures here on this earthly life. He says, look, this earthly life is nothing. You can lose it all. The moths destroy your clothes, and rust destroys your money, and thieves steal. He says, you need to set your mind on heaven, where nothing can destroy those things. It's not vain there at all. Even Paul, the apostle, said in Romans 8, he groans to be released from the futility of this earthly life and all the suffering and pain that goes with it, and to be rescued from it all in the resurrection. And there's a powerful truth. That's only possible because Jesus left heaven to come down and suffer the vanity of this earthly life. And you want to talk about vain, suffering the vanity of life? The most righteous person in the world, senselessly murdered at age 33. Vanity of vanities, indeed. Yet, He also gave us hope to one day be set free from the shackles of the vanity of earthly life, and He did that by conquering death's power to hold us in the grave. He did that, or when He did that, He subjected Himself to the vanity of this life, but then defeated vanity, so that once we die on this vain earth, one day we too will conquer vanity when we rise again from the grave and live with God forever. You see, the traditional view on this book claims that we can defeat vanity in this life. But what I'm proposing is that Solomon is saying that won't happen until the next life, until life beyond the sun. So make sure you're prepared for that life by fearing God and keeping His commandments, which is why he concludes the book by saying the conclusion when all has been heard is fear God, keep His commandments, because this is man's all. We serve God the best we can. We enjoy the good blessings as temporary gifts, knowing they won't last forever and they're not the source of our satisfaction. We roll with the punches when bad things happen because we know that's how things are in this earthly life. So we're not as rattled and destroyed when earthly life doesn't go our way. And then we trust God that one day He's going to fix this vanity problem and bring us to a new heavens and a new earth where there is no longer any curse. There is no longer any death or pain or suffering. So I know I did not leave you time to comment on that. If you want to talk to me about that differing view, that's why I ended, so you couldn't disagree. So now you can come to me, and I'd be happy to talk with you about that in person. Thank you so much. Read page 208A of your book, if you will, for Sunday. Adam will pick up in chapter 6, Lord willing.